So uh, we're on to the fourth session of the Digital Accessibility Bootcamp for designers, developers, policymakers, educators, and persons with disabilities. So today we're going to cover the topic accessibility guidelines for content creators, and we're going to focus on creating digital media and documents. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge Ms. Bernadette Lewis from the CTU for her contribution in terms of helping us to get where we are now and for providing additional support when called upon. And to Dr. Beverly Beckles for allowing us to be able to use the National Center for Persons with Disabilities for the field trip. Uh, it's a golden resource, and so when we do go to the field trip, we will be able to learn a lot more about the assistive technologies that persons with disabilities use. And again, to my team, it's 8 of us. I'm the team leader, and I'm very grateful for everyone who has contributed to this operation as we have it so far, and for as we go forward. I hope that we're able to contribute and continue to achieve a lot more than we have. So far we've completed 3 sessions. Today is the 4th, which is Tuesday, October the 15th. And in terms of the boot camp field trip, well, we weren't able to do the field trip today, which was the session scheduled for the Tuesday 15th. Ms. Giselle Ramos has indicated to me that the days that are available are the 16th of October, 17th, and 18th. Now, that's within this week. It is possible to do it another week, but it's a little bit of a challenge, so we'll have to coordinate and figure out what is the best day for all of us to be able to go on the field trip. And so far, I've gotten 5 people confirming that they want to go, but the days are not aligning well. So hopefully at the end of this session, you all can give me an idea as to what days, if one of these days will work, or if another day in another week will work for us. Okay, so just to recap the learning outcomes and objectives, the goal of this bootcamp is really to create an environment where software developers, educators, policymakers, designers, etc., can all learn and interact with each other and co-create projects that will help to solve accessibility problems in the workplace. And that the goal for that is that people who work in the field of accessibility and or whose work may impact persons with disabilities, sometimes we are unaware of how to make our work accessible. So by learning how to interact with each other and to understand each other's challenges, we can create better solutions. So just to go over quickly the course synopsis, we've already covered why web accessibility matters. We've looked into the different types of disabilities. We've looked at some of the assistive technologies. And today I'm going to cover a little bit or in terms of the accessibility skills required for various roles and to be able to guide designers and developers in terms of how to make their content accessible. So I'm going to be the presenter today. And the reason for that is I have a number of years working doing graphic design and website development. Today, I'm just going to focus mostly on the content aspect of it. How do you make content accessible in terms of PDF files, videos, Word files, etc.? How do you make those things accessible to screen readers as well as to many of the other tools that persons with disabilities would use? So just to recap the title, Accessibility Guidelines for Content Creators. And when we think about accessibility, we have to think in terms of the various types of disabilities and how can we create solutions in terms of what we are working on, whether it is a video or word file, or it could be a website, etc. How can you make your that content accessible? And so it's going to vary depending upon the type of disability that the person has. So there are five major areas that I've seen so far. One is, for instance, if it is the person has a visual impairment and they have low vision, you can make the text larger or you can increase the size of the screen. You can, if it is that you have color blindness, you can change the color contrast, you can increase font size, you can use screen readers, and if the person is deaf, you can use closed captioning. So that's just a kind of like a quick synopsis of what accessibility is about. I mean, it's not only that, but these are the key things that we have to focus on when we're creating digital documents. So over the last, I would say 3 decades, what we have seen is that we have a lot of the technologies have taken, for want of a better word, taken over. So we are, I would say, bombarded in many ways by new technologies. Some of it is very useful and it helps us to be able to improve our lives. I mean, everyone loves Amazon and eBay because you can buy things online, and in a lot of cases, you can get access to products that you wouldn't necessarily get in your local community or country. So it's important that we understand, what is the importance of, for instance, e-commerce, social media, digital marketing, analytics, etc., and how it impacts our lives. Because in one way or form or another, we are impacted by technology. And so we need to be able to make sure that that technology is accessible. And so just to quickly go over some of the technologies that are available, especially information for persons with disabilities, we need to look into digital content. So for example, ebooks, audiobooks, videos, etc. And then also of great importance would be e-government services and e-banking, because without access to those two, you can actually be at a huge disadvantage in society. So that's in terms of technologies that we currently have. But what we also seen is that there are new technologies that are emerging. Um, some of you might have heard buzzwords like virtual reality, blockchain, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, etc., Internet of Things. These are all things that are now growing, and a lot of the developers and designers are focused on that and not necessarily in terms of accessibility. And the consequences of that is that as the technologies begin to advance rapidly, persons with disabilities are at a huge disadvantage because they aren't able to keep up with the technology because the designers themselves are not catering for their needs. So that brings me to one of my key points, which is that there's a growing digital divide. And as a result of that, it means that persons with disabilities have not been able to benefit equally from the advancements in technology that we've had so far, right? Uh, as a result, the growing digital divide among persons with disabilities tends to exclude people from the digital economy. And the main reason for that is that it's due to inaccessible design. So that brings me now to the topic of design for accessibility. And how can we do that? And so we need to understand the various types of assistive technologies, or at least in some cases, the different types of disabilities and how they can support, the assistive technology can support them. So, for example, visual impairments come in a variety or spectrum. So, if someone has difficulties differentiating color, for example, color contrast, that can render them unable to be able to use the interface uh, for a website or be able to determine the text on a page in a book. Similarly, mobility and dexterity, they may not be able to operate the app that's on the phone, they may not necessarily be able to operate the website. And in terms of audio, if the person has a hearing impairment or they're, let's say, for example, they're totally deaf, then if whatever video or content that you've created has an audio component that is critical for them to understand it, then they've been excluded. And I have to say now that voice is becoming an important part of it. So, for example, if someone has a speech disability, then they can't really use tools like Siri and Cortina, etc., to be able to give commands. So there are a number of challenges coming up. So we have to understand each of the different disabilities and what are the technologies that are in place for us to be able to design effectively for that type of disability. Just to quickly close that off, so if someone has mobility challenges as well with respect to their hands, they have limited use of their hands, they can also use keyboard shortcuts. Or if they are blind, they can also use those keyboard shortcuts. And then for persons who are deaf, typically you rely on closed captioning or subtitles. So I just want to go over some basics in terms of design. And for those designers among us, they would know, for example, um, fonts, font families, typefaces, etc. So fonts are important because they impact the ability of the reader to understand them. So depending on if it's a serif or sans serif font, etc. Depending on the design and style, some fonts are easier to read than others. So if it is like, for example, use a fancy font, then chances are that you may exclude some of your readers who may have challenges, for example, like dyslexia, and find it difficult to be able to read and interpret that particular font. So what's generally recommended is that you use some standard fonts like Arial, Calibri, Century Gothic, Helvetica, Tuma, and Verdana, right? And you use sizes, at least 12 size font for those persons who could, and that's just for the average individuals. Below that, it would be very difficult for someone to read. What additional considerations I would say for the web is that you should be able to increase the size of the font, and the design of the website or design of the particular page shouldn't become unreadable, right? So for website accessibility, which I'll touch on a little bit in another session, you have to be able to ensure that all the functionality and all the text on the page doesn't lose its meaning or isn't illegible so that you can't read it. So in addition to the standard fonts that we are accustomed to, there are also font types for persons with disabilities. So for example, if someone has dyslexia, there's a special font called Dyslexie or Open Dyslexic, which places more emphasis on the bottom portion of the letters and it makes it a lot easier for the person with dyslexia to read it, right? So anybody who has dyslexia, or if you know someone who has dyslexia, you could recommend that they use that font, and it should help them to be able to read their work. Another type of font that was just developed for learning disabilities in this game is called FSME. And it's more of a bold font so that the person who might have difficulties distinguishing certain characters are easily able to look at it and distinguish it and say, okay, they understand the difference between an I or a J. So another key aspect of design is that whatever you write, whatever you're creating, it should be easy to read. And so when providing information to the general public, the message should be relayed in the simplest language possible. So one should really and truly strive to avoid a lot of jargon. You should try to be concise, try to be complete in what it is you're saying so that the person can easily read it and understand without having to read through too many long, drawn out sentences per se. If you keep your sentences short, it will help. And then if you use simple words that everyone would be familiar with, then the person doesn't have to use too much of their cognitive memory to try and understand, okay, what is it you're trying to explain here. So the simpler we make our language, the easier it is for everyone. And that will be especially true if the person has a cognitive disability. So I want to go over a bit about structuring the content. So when you're doing design, you have to look at layout, composition, you have to look at things like color contrast, font size, etc. And so there is, to some extent, there isn't like a best practice, but there are things that we know work and things that we know that don't work. And so designers tend to have a lot of flexibility and try to be very creative in how they lay things out. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who is reading what you've created is able to understand it. And so when it is, if you're designing something for accessibility, you want to avoid doing certain things. So some of the um, practices that it's tell you to avoid would be avoid using all caps, right? Because then it comes across like you're screaming at the person, and capital letters are much more difficult to read. Another don't is avoid putting valuable information in headers and footers, as the screen readers will ignore them. So that's a specific one for persons who are visually impaired, because if the screen reader doesn't read it, then they would never know that it's on the page. And if it's an important piece of information, then it's going to get totally ignored. Another thing they look at is underlining large blocks of text, as it reduces readability. So that's actually more to do with psychology of design and understanding how people look at certain things and how they internalize that information. Hyphenating words that are usually not split. So if it is this example here, continuation, it would be difficult for someone to understand it if it is that that's not how you typically read the word. And that typically happens like if it is you reach to the end of a sentence and then you try to join that particular word together because it didn't fit on that particular line. Another don't is using footnotes, as footnotes are difficult to make accessible. And then on the right hand side, I have a picture. I know it will be difficult for those who have visual impairments to see it, but essentially what the picture shows is that when you're aligning your text, you should try to use one direction. So we have horizontal text on the right hand side, which is standard throughout. Everything is horizontal. But on the left hand side, which is a don't, you have text, some of it being vertical, some of it being left right aligned, some of it being left aligned. And so that creates confusion in the mind of the individual because they can't tell in what direction the information is going to flow. So do you read from left to right, from right to left? Should you go from top to bottom? That's the challenge. So we had some don'ts, but they also have some do's. So in terms of what you should do, we talk about using headings and subheadings, right? So it would make it clearer for the individual who is looking to scan this page. What does this content contain? And reading the headings, just like when you read a newspaper, it's easy to pick out what the topic is about, and then you could decide if you want to read that particular section. But if it is you don't have clear headings and subheadings, it makes it a lot more difficult, especially if you're a skim reader. They also talk about keeping sections short. So we could only internalize so much information. And so if it is that you have very, very long sections, then sometimes we can get impatient. And once you get impatient, then you stop reading or you stop absorbing the information and in terms of what was intended. So it's important that you understand the reader and the reader's mindset. We talk about providing summaries for tables. So instead of having the person read the entire table and try to understand what content is inside of it, you can put a caption at the bottom that tells the person what exactly is contained in it. And then they could decide if they want to look through the details of those tables. We have to provide a glossary of terms to aid understanding of technical words. And that's definitely of great importance if it is that you're dealing with scientific or sometimes legal language, because those words are not very common, and so it can cause people to be confused, especially if it's a situation where they feel uncomfortable having to read it. And so if you use a lot of technical words, sometimes the reader can feel intimidated by the document that they're looking at. So I think having a glossary will help. Then we talk here about the full name abbreviations, right? You want to explain it. You want to explain any abbreviation when it first occurs so that if the person sees this abbreviation later down, then they would have an idea. But if it is that you don't explain the abbreviations, then people have to guess what those abbreviations mean. We're talking about having the appropriate size of font. And in this case, they're suggesting that a font size of 10 point and smaller is not accessible. And I agree. So I typically would use the smaller size of a 12 size font. And then the last thing has to do with keep left aligned to keep spaces between words. And in terms of left align, so we have justified, we could do right align, we could do left align, or we could do centered. But depending upon what you're doing, using, for example, justified mightn't necessarily be easily readable. So it's generally recommended as a best practice that you left align your content. Even if it's a brochure, sometimes you want to make it look nice, but you need to also think about, is it readable? Okay, some more do's. So use distinct spacings between lines, between paragraphs, and between sections. So when you're laying out your content, you need to be aware of, you know, how you space your content. And there are a number of technical terms that describe that. I don't remember them all off the top of my head. But if you're interested in doing that, I could share some learning about those technical terms. I could share some of the information. But once you understand a little bit about line spacing, justification, leading, etc., you can then go into the settings and adjust the paragraph size, the paragraph height, etc. And that will allow you to be able to make your content a little bit more accessible. Another recommendation is to use bold for strong emphasis. But of course, don't use too much bold because it makes it difficult to read. So you have to know when you want to use bold and when, in other words, when is it appropriate and when is it not. So if you use too much bold, it will become, it's almost like using caps. It's going to scream out at the person. So be very, very conservative in how you use it. In terms of underlining and hyperlinks, well, this is more of a functionality problem. So if it is that you don't underline or embed the hyperlinks, then what it's suggesting here is that it may not work when you export it to a PDF, right? Okay, another recommendation is to use concise but descriptive hyperlink text. That is definitely a challenge if it is that you have a very long text with random strings of letters and numbers. So what I have started doing is I use the tiny URL. That helps me to create short strings that I can actually put a descriptive link on text inside of it. So for example, with the application form for the bootcamp, I would have used tiny URL and then specifically stated field trip, bootcamp, etc. on the end of it. So it's easier for you to be able to type it over. We talk about use appropriate alt text for all images and tables. Right, so most of the software, like for example, Microsoft, PowerPoint, etc., they have an, a formatting or setting option for all text. And the reason for that is that if the person who is using a screen reader was to try to understand what the image is about, they would need to utilize that particular feature. And sometimes, if you, for instance, myself, I'm guilty of it, you create a PowerPoint presentation and you don't put in the alt text, then it's not going to be accessible. So it's important to be able to go through the entire document and add the alt text for all the images if it's not a decorative image. And if the image is decorative, you could just specify that it's a decorative image and the screen reader will ignore it. Right, and the last recommendation that they have here is use accessible text and background color. And so that has to do with, for example, color contrast. How can you ensure that it's easily read? So that brings me to in fact, a test for those of us who don't have a visual impairment would be to look at the images on the right-hand side and to determine what is the number that you're seeing in these circles that are there. So for those of you who can see, and if it is that you can see and you can use a screen magnifier, please let me know if it is you can read this and what numbers are you seeing in each of these circles. You can unmute your mics and just let me know. Hello? Or you could just type in the chat. Anybody wants to take a try? Okay.
Sean,
The
2 persons
objective of
already.
this is really just to, oh, I'm hearing somebody now. Go ahead.
No, this is current, Sean. No, 2 persons give their responses already. Two
Oh, two
persons.
person give responses. Okay.
Okay.
Right. So I've seen Jeffrey and Sarah. Right. So 6, 8, 45, 56. Okay, good. Actually, so I had done this the first time and I couldn't see the first one, which was the 6. So it could be challenging for someone who has a visual impairment, whether it has to do with color blindness in this case, to be able to distinguish between certain colors. And that is especially true for the general population when it comes to color contrast for certain types of background and foreground colors, because it's easy for most people, I guess, to be able to distinguish certain things. But still, I can definitely say that I've gone on many websites and found myself straining to be able to read the text on the site. And that's, for example, a lot of ministry websites where the person would have created this, used some fancy fonts, and then on top of that, didn't use a color contrast that would have allowed for me to be able to read it. So we have a lot of challenges, I think, in the design space with respect to that. So it's important that we understand color contrast. And actually, in fact, what I want to do is a quick demo, all right? I think I'll do a quick demo on that. Right, so there's a tool called a color contrast checker. And what the color contrast checker allows you to do is to utilize text, hexadecimal numbers or RGB numbers to determine whether the text on a background could be easily seen. So you have a hexadecimal number for the foreground color and a hexadecimal number for the background color. And depending upon the combination that you choose, you could get a pass or fail on what you call the WCAG guidelines. And it would look at, for example, minimum contrast, enhanced contrast, or non-text contrast. So it's really and truly just talking about, can the average person be able to see this thing or not? So I'm just going to demo that particular tool so you all can see it, for those who can see, of course. Okay, right, so I have here the color contrast checker open. In fact, I should have, right. And I'm going to select 2 colors. And, or in fact, I could type in the colors. So for example, if I choose to do white and white, I would see that it's going to fail. Right? So white is 255 255, and 255. Right. So when I do that, I automatically get fail on the minimum contrast, fail on the enhanced contrast, fail on the non-text. If I choose another text, let's say for another color, let's say gray. I'm going to use hexadecimal numbers in this instance. So if I do gray on white, which is 91, 95, 96, I'm still getting a fail. But if I use, for example, black and white, and black is going to be 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, I get an automatic pass because black and white basically on two opposite ends of the spectrum, right? They contrast very well. So a designer who has access to this tool could basically attempt to come up with a color palette that he can then test to determine whether the color contrast will work for whatever it is he's doing. So it's a very nice tool, and I'll just tell you the name of it. It's a color contrast analyzer. Can everybody hear me? It's a color contrast analyzer by Pasilio Group. So a very, very nice tool. It's available on both Windows and the Mac OS. So I could always share a link to it if you're interested.
Sean,
Yes.
it's a software?
Yes, it's a software.
Okay, so color contrast analyzer.
Yeah, color contrast analyzer.
Right, right.
All right.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this question relates to another feature on the web that sometimes you come across from time to time. You know the feature where you hear me, right?
Yes, I'm loud and clear.
Right. Yeah, good. The feature where when you go on certain things like when you have to sign into accounts and so on, and you get this "I am not a robot" thing, and you have to click
The
on
capture.
and then you have to capture image, right? Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there a way that could change and become a little more accessible?
Well, that's an interesting discussion that I've been having with Asinat, and I have brought it up at the LACNIC event as well, which I went to in Panama. So the challenge with that is that not everyone is there's a need for security, but at the same time, the challenge, of course, is how do you get security without making things much more difficult for persons to use. So I have a suggestion or a solution, but it is now under development, right? So I'll share my idea, and I could also get some feedback from the group, about whether this will work for you, because it may make things simpler or it may make things more complicated. It depends upon, yeah, go ahead.
What it actually shows on the web? It actually shows numbers where you have to look at or something like that?
Oh, for the capture? So the captures are usually numbers.
Yeah, for the capture.
Yeah, usually like a random string of numbers and letters that you type in,
right.
And then it would confirm it against that string. So for example, if you had to type in 1Z capital A, common B, capital F, they would show you a kind of squiggly set of text, and then you now have to figure out what those texts are and type it in. and then the computer code would then evaluate the text against the image, and if it is that the text is the same, then they would allow you to register or to sign in, as the case may be. Now, the
Yeah,
reason for
yeah, yeah.
that is that they're trying to prevent what they call
Security
bots
purposes. Yeah.
from being able to access your
Mm-hmm.
account and send spam emails, etc. But it complicates
Yeah.
things for someone with a disability, because then you can't see the
That,
random
that's
string
it.
of letters and numbers on that page.
And then even though you have a audio, you have the audio challenge, you have the audio output, but then the audio when you listen to that, it's not clear at all.
Right, yes. So the audio is the alternative, and as Asina has been telling me, he said uh, the audio is not clear, as you
No.
just mentioned. So it creates additional challenges. So there is a need for a
So you could get a
solution.
little
Yeah,
more.
there's a need for a solution to that problem. So we can actually think up ways in which we could create a much more simpler login that's still more secure, right? But I would share
Mhm.
my ideas. So just briefly, in terms of when you go to a website, there's usually one login page, right? My idea is that instead of having one login page, there's an infinite number of login pages. Now, that might sound complicated, but it doesn't have to be, because the person can have their own URL. So, for example, if you go to facebook.com, you would get the login page for that. But if you go to facebook.com login slash, let's say, for example, um, Karen, then you have your own
Yeah.
login page that you could get to. So the way in which I would do that is I was going to create a barcode or some kind of QR code that the person doesn't have to remember the URL, and then it would take them directly to that page. And then the only thing you'd have to do to confirm that it's you is put in like a six digit number, right? And that's something that will be automatically given to you. So you would have a more like a public URL that's directly says this is your login page, and then a 6 digit code that says this is who you are. You never have to change that. Right?
Hello.
But anyways, I'm still open to other ideas or suggestions or terms of what could be done, because I know it's a real problem, and I don't I don't foresee the people who create the technologies making it simpler. Any more questions on that, or suggestions as to what could be done? Yeah, Karen?
Yeah. Yeah. And I just dropped there, but you hear me now, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, cool. So what you're trying to say is like, for example, if I have to go into my login page, I will go to facebook.com login slash Karen, and when they ask
Yes.
me if I'm a bot or I'm a human, that's the code that is given to me.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Well, all right.
All right. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that that is a simpler solution, but again, it's left to be tested. See, the only way we would know if something is accessible or not is if I do it, and then someone who has a disability within a very or who has a varying type of disability, because not just person who's blind, but someone who might have hands, someone who might be able to hear, etc. How can you
Yeah.
create technology that's accessible to them? So that's why co-creating a solution is important,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm just gonna share my screen again, put it full screen. Right, get full screen now. All right, so I just shared a little bit about the color contrast analyzer. There are a number of other tools that you could look at, like the color contrast checker by snook.ca. there's a color oracle, which in fact is an easy to use color blindness simulator. And then there's a web aim color contrast checker. So I could share some links to that so you all could actually take a look at it and try it for yourselves. All right. So I briefly talked about alternative text. I think most people would be familiar with it. But essentially, when you're creating something in Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, on a website, for example, on social media sites like Facebook or even on Instagram, there's always an option for you to put alternative text. And so when you're doing that, you want to write something that's very descriptive. So I have a picture on the right-hand side that shows a number of persons sitting down. So we could actually describe this image as 5 people sitting down, and that's not very descriptive. Or we could use what they have suggested here, which is a group of people with and without disabilities sat at the entrance of a building laughing while they pose. So we have a much more descriptive example of the image versus what I just stated before, which is 5 people sitting down or 6 people sitting down in this picture. So the challenge, of course, with accessibility is that someone has to take the time to come up with these descriptions, and they have to do it for every single image. And so if it is that we're going to be able to go forward, there needs to be, to some extent, an incentive or a standard that people would use to say, okay, this is what you're going to do if it is you're going to produce a textbook, or you're going to produce a website, or you're going to produce content for the web and anything. You need to be able to say, okay, um, this is what you should follow. And you may need to increase the budget accordingly to pay the people to create all these alternative text descriptions. Okay. So,
Hey, one question again.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Going back to the color analyzer, we just spoke about before.
Okay, all right.
So that software, that it helps you to mix the colors and look at the best color to choose.
Yes, so when you can look at two colors of what you say a foreground color and a background color, and determine whether if I use font on for the foreground, how would
Mm-hmm.
it come? How would it appear to the person who's looking at it? So would it be easily understood,
Right.
or would it be difficult? So if I use
It's
two
like,
very, very similar colors, it's going to be very, very difficult for the person to be able to distinguish the two. Or if the
right.
person has, for example, color blindness, and we use red and green, and that's their color blindness problem or challenge, then they wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
right?
understand. I
Yeah,
understand because like this, if you use black background and you use like probably dark gray foreground, obviously that is not good color contrasting. So
yes. So it
like
wouldn't
you better
contrast
put
enough.
you might better put a white foreground against the black background.
Correct, right?
Yeah.
So that now it's easy for us to know, okay, black and white will contrast well, but it's harder to say, okay, for example, whether yellow and green would contrast well, or
Yeah.
if blue and purple, or blue and green would
Mm-hmm.
contrast well,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's where that tool would come in, because you can, once you create a color palette, and in fact there's a tool that you could use from
Yeah.
Adobe. The Adobe has a color wheel, which I could probably show you that as well. Let me go to the website. Right. So Adobe has a color wheel, and you can use, for example, analogous colors, right? So I'm just moving the color wheel around, and the colors are going to change. There's also monochromatic. Right. I know it might be challenging for some people to see it, but let me know if you're actually seeing the differences here, right? And then there's a triad. So for example, you could take colors on different ends of the spectrum and create a color palette with it. So a designer who is using this tool could create the color palette and then go into the color contrast checker and determine if the color palette would work for what they want. So they'll be able to say, okay, these two colors are contrasting well enough, and I could use them on my website or in my magazine or any other document that they're creating. Make sense? Or
Yeah, that's making more sense.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
all right. So back to the presentation. Right.
But
So,
sure.
yeah, go ahead.
The access. Okay, so for example, a blind or visually impaired person is doing like content on Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or even HTML. So,
Right.
is those tools you just spoke about, the Adobe tool and the color analyzer.
Mm-hmm.
Are they accessible? Can we do our color matching ourselves? Can we make and so on like that, like what you were demonstrating?
Oh, okay. So that's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how accessible the tools themselves are. So I will have to do some research for
Right.
you, right?
So we got a contact Sean then.
Yeah. All right, cool. So I would say last section that I have here is on creating accessible video. And the focus here is really for persons who are either deaf or hard of hearing, because they're the ones who are generally speaking going to use the closed captions or the subtitles. I mean, it's also context dependent because I use subtitles if I'm on a train or I'm on the plane and there's a lot of noise. But in terms of accessibility, let's say we're focusing on persons who are deaf or hard of hearing, you can use tools like Adobe Premiere, but Premiere has an option in it that you can add closed captions. And then there's also, for example, YouTube has automated closed captioning. So if you upload a video, it would analyze your speech and create the closed captions for you. Now, once you create the closed caption, it's going to generate what they call a .srt file. So you can actually take that SRT file and actually merge it with the video, or you can add it from one platform to another. So it automatically takes the closed caption and transfer it to a next video. And if it is that you're doing it with Premiere Pro, which is what I use a lot, then there's a resource on Adobe. So I put a link to it here. It's one called Premiere Pro using or working with captions. And it will take you to that page, and that resource would allow you to learn a lot more about how you create the closed captions for yourself, right? And I just have an image here of how that process looks. So what you'll see is the create a closed caption, and then they use the timeline to determine when that particular closed caption is going to appear. So that was the last of my presentation. I just want to thank everybody for for listening to the entire thing, and for Karen for your questions. So I would just open up the floor now for anybody who has any additional questions to ask. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about accessible content, how you create it, challenges that they may have specifically with getting with content on the sites? Okay, I'm seeing one question in the chat. Okay, Jeffrey says no questions. All right, anybody else?
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not really question, but comment, good information as usual. Regarding like websites.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, websites. There's certain websites they may have like buttons or like to switch over to like 3 views.
Right.
It just a menu, but when you open it, it may not be able to read. You may have to use, So like certain things like that, I might just recommend to put everything like in a list or even as simple as a combo box.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to actually cover websites in more detail on our next webinar, but just to answer your question,
Okay.
there are tools that you can use, and there's certain best practices that they have in place for when you're creating a menu. So the WebAIM, they have an accessibility checker that you can plug in the URL for a website, and you'll be able to tell if it's accessible. Now, there are different levels of accessibility. So there's A, AA, and AAA ratings. And so when you plug in a website, it would do like a report on the website, and they'll analyze like all of the different elements and give you a report stating, okay, well, this heading, this particular button, this menu, or this text, or this color contrast wasn't accessible. Now, it's not always the most informative. Sometimes it could be a bit unclear as to what you need to do. So there are other tools that developers could use, like AXCore, that would give you much more details. So I will do another webinar on that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Any more questions?
I like the idea of the fonts where you spoke about the different types of fonts to use.
Yes, no, I didn't hear that question, that comment properly.
No, the font.
Oh,
where
the
you
font.
spoke about font.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
what to use and what not to use. So.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what I'll do is I'll share a resource that I got that has a lot more details on digital accessibility and web accessibility. Right. But what I shared here, if you run with that, I think you'll be able to create enough accessible content. Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else wants to make a comment? You're free to type in the chat as well. Okay. Well, if you don't have any more comments, I want to just ask everyone about the field trip and the date specifically. I would have shared a link in the chat, and I know only a few persons actually filled it out. So I just want to get an idea based upon the change in schedule for the field trip and the fact that we can do it on either tomorrow, Thursday, or Friday, or if we should look at another day. So if you can give me some feedback on that, that would be greatly appreciated.
Sean, you say Monday is not available, you say, right?
Well, I didn't talk to them about Monday in terms of next week
Oh,
Monday, that is. Um,
mm-hmm.
but as long as I know, how many people are willing to go on what days they're available, I could
Right.
then talk to Giselle and confirm a date that we should go on.
Mm. I would say for me Friday this week or Monday next week.
Friday or Monday next week. Anybody else? Could just type in the chat, or preferably go to the form and fill it out, and that'll give me a clearer idea as to how many people want to go to a field trip.
Yes, good night, Sean,
Yeah,
Richard. Yeah,
yeah,
Monday for me will be good.
will be better.
Monday.
Okay, so far 2
Yes.
Mondays. Okay. Anybody else?
Okay.
I still have to fill out the form, Sean, or this information good enough?
I mean, preferably you fill it out, because then what I could do is I'll talk
Okay,
to Ms. Bernadette Lewis from the CTU to confirm with her and say these number of people are interested in going to it, and I would need this amount of funding in order to facilitate. So it would be helpful. Okay, seen in the chat. Okay, well, Jeffrey says he works at the NCPD. So, all right. Sarah says she has to go. All right, I think Sarah has gone already. Okay, so I'm not getting much responses. So I know so far that Karen and Richard wants to go on Monday. Okay, so I will ask around again. I mean, if I could get confirmed 5 people to say, okay, we want to do it on the Monday, I think that would be sufficient for us to at least get a good section in.
Sean.
Asina?
Yeah, hi, good night. I would not be able to make it this week, no, next week. God willing.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
All right, anybody else wouldn't be able to make it? Okay. Well, if you don't have, see here, one more response in the chat. All right, Verena said she will be there. Okay, great. So at least All right, so we should have at least 5 people. Right. Okay, excellent. All right, guys. So what I'll do is I will look at the link I sent with the form, see who responded, and I will take into consideration what was discussed here, and then I will send out a notice in terms of what the date will be. But most likely it will be the Monday, considering that everybody says that it will be available for that day. All right. So if we have no further questions, I will end the webinar. So just let me know, yes or no. Okay.
So what was your question just now?
No, I'm asking, I said, if anyone has any further questions. If not, then I'll end the webinar.
Oh, okay. It doesn't seem so though.
Okay. All right.
No further questions, Sean. Just this is good information, man.
All right, great. All right, thanks a lot. So for everyone who attended, thanks a lot for coming out and for, being a part of this. I know we have a lot more to do, but, I'm hoping that you all will be able to take away something from it and implement it in your individual careers. So with that, do have a blessed night, and hopefully I'll see you guys on Tuesday.
Right.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, Sean.
Good night.